Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Astrology with PZ. Today I'm going to be looking at the moon. I'm going to try to share some rules of thumb that I apply when I'm trading and some correlations between the moon, the phases, its transits, and the pricing within financial markets. The moon is the closest object to us on Earth, and as such, its cycle is a lot faster than the other planets. I just want to make it clear that a full cycle of the moon is referred to as the lunar cycle, the lunar month, which is 28 days. That is different to the months we have on our calendar, which are in relation to the movement of the sun around the zodiac. So the two should not be confused with each other. When I'm talking in this video about the lunar cycle, the lunar month, I am referring purely to the moon itself. So due to its proximity, it is the closest object and therefore has the biggest impact on our lives. Now, in natal astrology, the moon is critical. We use it to explain a lot of the individual's traits, and after the sun, the moon has a great impact on the individual's character. The traits of the moon relate to the feelings and the emotions of the person. What gives them comfort? What are their ambitions? The moon also acts as an indicator as to how they feel about their mother, how they feel towards their mother, what role that she would play in their lives, and also the ideal woman and therefore their partners, their ideal partner in life. The moon is an indication of home life, family life for the individual, and I guess some physical weaknesses as well are determined by the moon. In much the same way that we know the moon affects the movement of water and the tide around the Earth, it does have a huge impact on our physical body. After all, our body is over 70%, some people say over 90% water, and we know that our emotions are linked with the hormones we have flowing through our body. So the moon is critical in regulating the hormones and our emotions. I'm not going to spend too much time on the natal astrology in this video. I will make a separate video because there is a very interesting technique, very simple technique that can be used to avoid any issues when undertaking surgery by just looking at the moon. But I'll keep that to a separate video. In this particular video, I'm going to focus in on the mundane side of astrology. And on the mundane side, like I've said, the moon plays a critical role with regards to regulating the waters, the tide on Earth, and that by itself has huge implications on the ecosystem. The moon also acts as an indicator for the population, the people within a country, and when looking at trading, the market participants is resembled by the moon, and the mood, the collective consciousness of those individuals that are participating within that market. So that's critical. That's very important in terms of as a trader, when we want to time when we should enter the market, when we should leave the market, and when is the market going to hit a peak or a trough. So I will go on to explain that further down this video. The moon also resembles the homeland, the nation, and again in a separate video I'll explain how we can use the moon to determine the climate, the change in temperature that will occur within a given month. So the juicy part about this video is cycles. What are cycles? Let me just lay the foundation. When we look at life, there is generally a birth phase, and that could be an idea, it can be a person, it can be an object or an invention, it can be a project. But there's usually a birth phase, there's a general incline, a growth phase, until that person or object or idea reaches a peak, from which then there's a decline phase, a weakening, and ultimately a death or a completion. So that essentially resembles, can be drawn as a sine wave, a birth, an increase, and then a decline and a death, and then a new cycle can begin. So makes it really easy for us when we're trading, because we generally do see a lot of waves. So it's easier to pick out general cycles. And our job as astrologers is to identify cycles that are happening every day around us and try to correlate those cycles to planets. Now, the way we do that is by understanding the underlying traits of that cycle. What is it that we're talking about? What is it that we're trying to determine a cycle for? Can we link that to a specific trait for a planet? Each planet has a trait. If that can be done, perfect. And another way of doing it is by looking at the timing of that cycle. How quickly does it go from a birth phase to a growth to a decline? So, for example, when we're tracking the height of water and the tide, we can see, well, the tide comes in and increases twice a day. So what could we correlate that to? It's obviously going to be the Earth's rotation around itself in comparison to the moon. And we're saying the gravity of the moon is pulling the water in an elongated fashion, and the Earth is making a 24-hour cycle around itself. So when the waters are elongated, it's going to hit within 24 hours. It's going to hit 2 points at which the water mass is going to be higher than the other 2 points. So it's key to understand the time frame of the cycles that we're considering. That aside, the moon almost acts as a gatekeeper. So if there's energy coming from the outer planets any further out than the moon, when there's key aspects, when events are supposed to occur, sometimes the event is delayed until the moon reaches a key phase. The key phases are referred to as lunations. They're generally a new moon and a full moon. So let me explain that. When we're talking about the phases of the moon, we're actually trying to explain the correlation between the sun and the moon. Where are they positioned? The sun, Earth, and the moon, I guess, because we're sitting here on Earth and we've got the two objects around us. So we're trying to understand their correlation to one another. Now, first and foremost, it's important to note that the disk size of the sun and the moon are pretty much exactly the same size when we look at them in the sky. That by itself is amazing. It's almost planned. There's a lot of little unique facts that you'll pick up on when you start to look at the moon, and that it makes you think, well, it is a greater plan and a strategy out there. This just can't be a coincidence. The fact that whilst it's spinning around the Earth, the moon is locked in an orbit in such a fashion that we always see one side of the moon and never the back side of the moon. And the fact that from our position of observation on Earth, the disk size of the moon and the sun are pretty much exactly the same. Isn't that amazing, given the fact that their mass is so different from one another, and it's in relation to their distance from Earth that phenomena occurs. So, given that these two disks or objects are the biggest that we observe, they're obviously going to have the biggest impact on us. So that's why the phase of the moon is so important to understand. And the key four phases I want you to grasp, if you go back to the previous slide, you'll notice that I had the diagram as well. The new moon phase is when the sun and the moon are conjunct. From our perspective, they're 0 degrees and they're aligned with the Earth. And then the moon is obviously moving a lot faster than the sun. It takes it about a week, and from that point onwards, from its conjunction, we say the moon starts waxing. So the crescent starts to get increase in size. There's more and more light until we get to the half moon a week later, and finally we get to the full moon within 14 days, 2 weeks. At that point, the light is at its maximum, and the moon enters its waning phase. So the light starts to decrease in size, and the crescent starts to get smaller and smaller. And it will take a week until it reaches a half crescent, and then finally the following week we have a new moon. So I would urge you to Google this, and there are some great videos on it if you don't quite understand it. But the phases of the moon are very important, because when it comes to astrology, we find that key events tend to happen at either a new moon or a full moon phase. These are referred to as the lunations. And generally, these are the 2 points, if they're close to the lunar nodes, that we from our perspective on Earth, we see eclipses occur. So again, I'll do a separate video on eclipses because they have a wealth of information, and they trigger a lot of events, big events around the world, especially in mundane astrology. The other thing I wanted to cover when we're looking at phases is you can link the phases of any pair of planets, this is referred to as planetary harmonics, to a cycle. So for example, we were just looking at the phases of the moon. We said that a complete cycle is 28 days. It takes it from the new moon, that's a birth point, that's the creation point. And generally, you could use that as a rule of thumb. Whenever you're planting something, be it physically planting a flower or a plant, or be it a new idea, a new project, a new house that you're looking to buy, the best time to do it is at a new moon. And then a week later, that you've essentially gone halfway across the increase phase, the growth phase. So whilst the moon is waxing, the cycle is gaining strength, energy, and it will reach its peak at the full moon. From that point onwards, there's a decline, there's a weakening happening until that idea or that new project comes to an end. Now, this is really interesting when you're looking at, and we see this commonly. We see this when I'm trading. So I want to give you an example. On the 23rd of February 2020, we saw the market, and you could look at the American markets, the UK markets, anywhere around the world. They follow the same pattern. Around the 20th of February, the markets reached all-time highs. So that we say that there was a market crest that formed. It topped out around 20th of February, and there was a decline of about 40% in most markets that occurred within the next lunar month. So from the 23rd of February until the new moon of the 23rd of March, the markets fell about 40%, and they stopped falling on the 23rd of March on the new moon. Now, you would expect it just to fall at a regular speed, but it didn't. We said the waxing phase is a growth phase. So although it was dropping, it dropped very slowly during its waxing phase. And then we had the full moon. And from that point onwards, about 2/3 of that price drop occurred during the waning phase, the last 2 weeks of that lunar month. So I'm saying this to explain that it's critical to look at the phases of the moon. Another example in the financial markets, you will notice in April, the new moon around April, essentially that was the following month from the one I've just explained. That was when crude oil prices and generally WTI and crude oils bottomed out at that new moon, and since then they've been growing. So the lunations can be used to determine when markets are reversing, be it reaching a peak or reaching a trough. So when we're trading, they're very important. The next important pattern I always look out for are the transits, or as the moon ingresses a new sign. What do we mean by an ingress? It means entering a new sign. The image I've put up on this slide, you'll notice that we have the 12 signs of the zodiac, and what I've done is I've highlighted on there the sign of Taurus in green, because the moon is exalted in Taurus. It feels really comfortable. It likes being in Taurus, and Taurus traditionally has the trait of financial markets, money, currencies. So whenever I'll go on to explain some patterns in terms of what happens when the moon enters Taurus, but just bear that in mind. So the moon is exalted and likes being in Taurus, and therefore its fall will be the opposite sign, Scorpio, and I've marked that one in red. Now, one of the big effects that the moon has during its phases, its new moon and full moon phases, are that it makes people more irrational, or another word for it is emotional. So people become more emotional and tend to do things without thinking it through with a rational mind. They tend to react. So a lot of studies and statistics have already been produced that explain whenever we have full moons, there tends to be an increase in crime rates, accidents, hospitals, fire services, and the police services see a little increase in activity during a full moon. Now, when we're looking at transits, a similar incident happens every time the moon enters Scorpio. So what we tend to see is the moon takes 28 days to do a complete cycle. Therefore, it will spend about 2.5 days in each sign. And what we should do is track which sign it's in, and that will give us a great idea in terms of the sort of events that are going to manifest during those periods. Now, when we're looking at financial markets, what I've noticed is we generally tend to see an increase in the markets when the moon is in Taurus, and the opposite will occur. We generally seem to appear to see a sharp fall in the market when it's in Scorpio, which kind of makes sense. If the moon rules over our emotions and the mass consciousness, you have a high number of participants in the market. When everyone is in control of their emotions and are thinking rationally, that would occur when the moon is in Taurus, when it's exalted. People are not suddenly going to freak out and panic. Whereas the opposite is true for Scorpio. When the moon enters the sign of Scorpio, people emotions are heightened, and they tend to suddenly panic, and they sense stress a lot more, and we generally say you shouldn't make any important decisions when the moon is in Scorpio. So the two key cycles when we're looking at the moon are the phases and the transits that we have to watch out for. The third one, relating to the nodes, I'm gonna keep that to a separate video, because I have to explain what the lunar nodes are and what impact they have. But that's a much longer cycle. That's an 18-year cycle, which dominates the financial markets as well. So how can we use the moon when we're trading the markets? It really depends on your strategy. When you're trading, every individual should look at the time horizon that they're trading and investing their money for. We have a short-term time horizon, a mid-term, and a long-term. In my mind, the long-term should not be anything shorter than 18 to 20 years. So the mid-term might end up being anything between a year to a couple of years, and the short term can be anything from a couple of days to a couple of months. Now, the rules of thumb that I apply and I've observed are that if you are using short-term trading strategies, if you're trying to go long in a market, as in you're trying to buy low and then sell high, look for periods when the moon is waxing. So from the new moon until the full moon, those 2 weeks will generally give you the greatest returns. You should also look at when the moon is entering the sign of Taurus and Scorpio, because irrespective of the phase of the moon, when it enters those signs, it does generally tend to buck the trend. So if the prices are falling and the moon enters Taurus, they slow down. They may continue to fall, but they will slow down, and the percentages that they're falling by will decrease. And if prices are increasing and the moon goes into Taurus, well, you'll see them really jump during those 2 days. So, and the opposite is true for Scorpio. Midterm time horizon, I would use the lunations, the new moon and the full moon, as triggers for potential market reversals. You have to look at the outer planets, and I'll explain these in videos, and I'm planning to make weekly videos. I'll tell you about key events that are happening for the month ahead, and what I'm planning to do is give you when I believe things will reverse, or what periods to look out for signals when the market may be reversing. And finally, for the long-term investment strategies, I'm going to make a totally separate video to keep them short, and I'll explain how we can use the lunar nodes for that. So we're currently in the week commencing the 3rd of August. We had our full moon yesterday, and we saw a lot of markets again reach their peak, what I believe is their peak. So we have to look now for reversals in some of the financial markets, because we're now entering a waning phase. Beyond that, there's also some indicators which I'll put into a separate video, that markets may be reversing as a result of the aspects being formed by other planets. So this lunation, so this full moon that occurred yesterday, may be the point at which the financial markets, like the S&P 500, the FTSE 100, and the NASDAQ, may have reached a crest and might be turning. And what should we look out for? The moon is going to be in Taurus between the 10th to the 12th of August. So depending on what you're investing in, Taurus, I said it is a sign for currencies. We're seeing the dollar weakening against the euro and the sterling, and as a result, gold and silver going up as well at the same time. So depending on which one you're trading, when between those 2 days, the 10th to the 12th of August, you should see some strong movements. And our new moon is on the 18th of August. So that's the next lunation, and that's in the sign of Leo. So the Leo is ruled by the sun. One of the traits of the sign is gold. So it's interesting, as the sun came into Leo, ingressed into the sign of Leo, we saw gold hit all-time high prices that it has never reached before. And since it's broken that resistance point, it's still going up. So I would look for signs of a reversal around the 18th of August, although I haven't seen anything suggesting that there might be a reversal. But it's good to just keep an eye out for these dates. And finally, Moon will enter Scorpio between the 23rd and 25th of August. So keep an eye out. Depending on what you're trading, we might see a fall during that time frame. So what I'm sharing with you here are rules of thumb. They don't necessarily happen 100% of the time because there are a lot of variables at play here. I'm just saying that the moon is one of the key variables and we should always pay attention to it. What I've done is try to provide some statistics to back up my hypothesis, what I believe happens when the moon is traveling around the zodiac. So what I've done is to take the S&P 500, the top 500 companies trading in the US markets, and I've looked at a time frame of 20 years. And I've said the market went up by 1,716 points, so it more than doubled. It went up by 120% over that 20-year period. And then I took the closing price for each day and compared it to the previous day, and then summed up all those changes for when the moon was in Taurus. And what I found was during periods when the moon was in Taurus, the market went up 753 points. So out of our 1,716 points, 753 of those increases occurred when the moon was in Taurus. That's just over 40 to 44%. And when the moon was in Scorpio, when I took the sum of all the price movements, it was actually negative. So the markets actually dropped by 52 points when the moon was in Scorpio. Now it was interesting, when I was doing the statistics, I found I was expecting it to drop by the greatest number of points when the moon was in Scorpio, but the greatest was actually when the moon was in Sagittarius. It dropped by 128 points when the moon was in Sagittarius. And at first that didn't make sense, but after reflecting on it, it did. Now, the markets only trade 5 days a week. So when the moon enters Scorpio over a weekend, the impact of that energy tends to present itself when the markets reopen again. And that generally happens in the next sign, which is Scorpio. That's one reason. The second reason is whenever we're talking about lunations, new moons, full moons, you should always allow an orb of 2 or 3 days either side of the specific day that I'm giving to you. So the energies are present 2 or 3 days on either side. So you will always see the drop that I'm talking about. It may occur a little bit early when the moon is still in Libra, or it may occur just a day or two afterwards when it's entered Sagittarius. So keep that in mind as well. Bear that in mind. The other thing I looked at was over the past 12 months, we've seen the S&P 500 increase by 243 points. And I try to correlate those daily price movements with whether the moon was waxing, was it in a waxing phase or was it in a waning phase. So we said a waxing phase is from the point that the moon and the sun form a conjunction. So we have a new moon all the way until a full moon. So it's gaining light, gaining energy, gaining momentum. And what we see is out of those 243 points, 218 of those points occurred during a waxing phase. And then a waning phase from a full moon down to a new moon, so it's losing light, and we see only 25-point increases occurred during the waning phase. So I think that clearly demonstrates what I'm trying to pass along to you. In conclusion, try to look for uptrends during the waxing phase of the moon and when the moon is in the zodiac sign of Taurus, and look for downtrends during a waning phase and when the moon enters Scorpio. There are various apps you can download on your phone, and they will tell you which phase the moon is in and which sign it's in. I've put the website for Astro Theme down here because if you want to see where all the planets are, this is the best website to use. Perhaps in a later video, I will demonstrate how you can use the website. But for the time being, I think that information is readily accessible if you Google it. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Astrology with PZ. I hope you found it interesting. Please don't forget to subscribe and pass on to anyone else who you think might find this video interesting. Please check out our Instagram page, Astrology with PZ. We're going to try to share some interesting material on there as well.